Hello, and welcome to my Walks with a Camera. A little while ago I did a video called What's in Your Camera Bag? And I talked about the equipment that I have, and I gave some sage advice to budding photographers. And I also sort of laid out ideas for people to follow if they wanted to get into photography, what kind of equipment that they needed to buy. I've been thinking about, however, this subject for quite some time. You see, my YouTube channel actually puts forward two concepts or two ideas. One is photography and the other one is history, because I'm a history geek, and I always have been since I was 6 years old. And I've tried to combine my love of photography and my love of history to present both. Now, to be fair, there are times when it kind of makes my channel maybe a little schizophrenic because I'm hopping from one topic to the other, and the YouTube algorithm doesn't really like that. But the nice thing about photography is I can showcase the historic places that I go and visit and tell those stories. And with photography, I can be a photographer. Well, this little video, I thought, I've done what's in my camera bag, but I haven't explained as to why I'm a history geek and what's in your history bag, or what's in my history bag, and how I got there and how I combined the two. I thought I'd just explain that. Photography and history actually have a linkage, and that is they both tell stories. Now, history is a subject in high school that gets inflicted on us, and we just take it for the credit, or most people just take it for the credit and want to get it over with because, oh God, it is so boring talking about things that are 2,000 years old. And we really don't see a contact between the two, how we get from 2,000 years ago to us. And that's a problem, because photography is telling a story or capturing a story when you photograph an image. History tells a story, and that's the link between the two. And you can use photography to showcase a historic place or event or person. Likewise, you can take history and look at the history of images and photographs. I'll give you this example. Mathew Brady was an American photographer during the American Civil War, and he used to take his camera gear to battlefields and photograph them. Now, to be honest with you, if Mathew Brady had something like my Nikon Z5, he'd be laughing, because the equipment he had to take with him fit into a wagon. That was his camera bag, whereas my camera bag is a pack that fits on my back. But Mathew Brady and other photographers like him brought the Civil War to the general population and showed them the images in all their horror and in all their stories. Likewise, during the Crimea War, British photographers and French photographers went out and photographed the Crimean War. Now, that sort of sets the background as to why I'm a photographer and why I enjoy photographing, and not just historic events or not just historic reenactments, because I am a reenactor, and I've been a reenactor for 46 years. Here's the thing that I've really found compelling about history. When I was 6 years old, my parents took me to Fort York in Toronto. Now, Fort York was built in 1792 under the orders of the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, modern-day Ontario, a guy by the name of Sir John Graves Simcoe. Now, for my American colleagues, and this is the 250th anniversary of the American Civil War, if you watch a really bad TV program called Turn, and I'm going to explain to you why I think it's bad. Turn is about George Washington's spy network during the American Revolutionary War, which was extremely effective. But there's a character in there, John Graves Simcoe, who ends up commanding the Queen's Rangers. Now, in the program Turn, John Graves Simcoe is a complete and total psychopath. That is so far divorced from the historic reality as to not even be worth commenting on. So I'm going to comment on it. John Graves Simcoe did command a unit during the American Civil War, an American loyalist unit made up of loyal Americans who supported the legal, lawful government, the British Crown. They're also, as a regiment, still in existence and still on the order of battle of the Canadian Armed Forces in the reserves. In Toronto, they are known as the Queen's York Rangers, the 1st American Regiment. John Graves Simcoe became the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, Ontario. You're not going to put a totally blinded psychopath in command of a new colony. You're not going to do that. And Simcoe was an interesting guy, highly educated, a good administrator. He laid the foundations for the modern province of Ontario, and he was also a member of the Abolitionist Society in Great Britain. He was against slavery, and he attempted to outlaw slavery in Upper Canada. The Ontario legislature, or the Upper Canada legislature, was made up of American loyalists. Most of them owned slaves. And when Simcoe said to them, "I want to outlaw slavery," they said, "No, you're not." Because the legislature refused, there was nothing legally that Simcoe could do to outlaw slavery, except Simcoe could regulate external trade, that is, trade crossing the border. So he simply banned the importation of slaves into Upper Canada. The legislature said, "You can't do that." They screamed. He said, "Yes, I can." Because if you look at any piece of Ontario or Canadian federal legislation, there's a section in it that says the Lieutenant Governor, or in the case of federal law, the Governor in Council, can pass such regulations for the administration of this piece of legislation. And that's the power that Simcoe used. He said to the legislature, "You can't regulate trade. I can. I'm banning the importation of slaves." They said, "Then what are we going to do to get more slaves?" And Simcoe said, "You have a decision to make. Are slaves chattel property, or are they human beings? If they're chattel property, I can regulate the importation of said chattel property. If they're human beings, you can't keep them as slaves. They must be freed." And the legislature said they're chattel property. The next thing Simcoe did was he began to pass a series of regulations regulating slaves and how they were treated. He never said, "You can't own a slave. If you want to own one, own one. Own one, own 10, own 100. Here's the regulations you have to follow." And he made it so bureaucratic and governmental red tape that by the time slavery was outlawed in the British Empire and blacks were freed in 1834, there were only 50 slaves left in Upper Canada. All of them were over the age of 60. And the reason they were over the age of 60 is one of the regulations he passed said, if you have a slave that is older than 25, if you have a slave that is old and infirm, you can't sell them. You have to maintain them and keep them until they die. In effect, setting up the first social safety net in the British Empire. Now, the legislature in Upper Canada didn't like this. Simcoe didn't care. Now, there's a very good reason why Simcoe became the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada after the American Revolutionary War, which leads me to another point. When the Americans talk about the American Revolutionary War, they talk about the founding of America and the freeing of America from tyranny. A funny thing is, at the time, a lot of their systems of government were based on the British parliamentary system. They simply removed the king for a president and then regulated the president's powers, which is exactly what the British Parliament did and had been doing since the signing of Magna Carta in the 12th century. Parliament regulating the king, and it was an evolutionary process. That's kind of interesting. Now, the truth of the matter, what came out of the American Revolutionary War was not one country, 3. The United States, Canada, and Sierra Leone. See, during the American Revolutionary War, the British encouraged slaves to escape from their owners and come to British lines, where they put them to work in construction units, or in a few cases they actually raised regiments of freed slaves and armed them. One of the things that the founders of the United States demanded in the Treaty of Paris, and directly to British authorities that were busily evacuating all the American loyalists from the United States, was, we want you to return our slaves. And the British administration went, no. They came, they loyally served. We're not going to give them back to you. They've earned their freedom. And those black citizens were settled in Nova Scotia, the new province of New Brunswick, Quebec, and the new province of Upper Canada. Just so you know, Quebec was changed to Lower Canada, and I'll get into that. They also set up the country of Sierra Leone for any blacks who wanted to return to Africa, and there were quite a few. So the truth of the matter is, history is complicated. It's not just one answer that's clean and dry. You can't simply point to one event. So Simcoe becomes the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, and he establishes the procedures and policies that will help Ontario, or Upper Canada, grow into the province it is today. That's history. When you stand in the middle of a city like Toronto, or I did at 6 years old in the middle of Fort York, and ask that question, how did this get here? How did this evolve into this? And those are the stories that history tells. People, places, and events. And Simcoe was an interesting guy. After 3 years, he returned to Britain. He wasn't in the best of health. But later, in the early 1790s, or middle 1790s, he was appointed Viceroy of India. India was the jewel in the British imperial crown. You're not going to appoint a psychopath to run that. He was an able administrator, and unfortunately, he was on his way to take his post. He was to head to Plymouth to board a ship to head to India when he suddenly died, and never took the position of Viceroy of India. There's history, and there's a story. You can find them all over. So when I was 6 years old, standing in the middle of Fort York, those stories came alive for me. I saw the places. I saw the buildings. There were two guys marching around dressed in uniforms of the King's 8th of Foot. That spoke to me. And history does. It tells us stories. And my photography, I try to photograph those stories. And I try to show them, this is what was, here's how this evolved into what we have today, and why. So yes, my channel at times can seem a little schizophrenic. But let me tell you another story. And it's kind of interesting because it's about a guy by the name of Anthony Westbrook, whose farm is 3 minutes from my house. And he was an interesting person because he served during the American Revolutionary War as an American loyalist. He's of Dutch descent, but he didn't serve in an official British provincial regiment such as Butler's Rangers, King's Rangers, Queen's Rangers, Loyal Rangers, Peter's Corps, Jessop's Corps, Leake's Independent Company, or the regiment I portrayed for about 15 years, the King's Royal Regiment of New York. All of those regiments came out of New York State and Pennsylvania and some as far away as Ohio, and helped to found the province that I live in today, Upper Canada, now Ontario. So let me go and show you Anthony Westbrook's farm, because he served with Joseph Brant, Tyondenaga, during the American Revolutionary War. And his story's kind of interesting. Let's go. I'll tell you about him when we get to where we're going. Behind me is the Westbrook family cemetery, and it's only about 3 minutes from my house. How the Westbrook family got here goes back to the American Revolutionary War, because had the American Revolutionary War never happened, Anthony Westbrook would never have ended up here. And he is buried somewhere in this cemetery. Now, my son has seen his tombstone. I haven't, but I believe my son. And this is where the final resting place of the Westbrook family came about. How they got here is rather interesting. See, during the American Revolutionary War, Anthony Westbrook and his two sons supported the king during the rebellion. For my American friends, they'd be Tories. For my Canadian friends, they're United Empire Loyalists. During the American Revolutionary War, Joseph Brant supported the crown. Now, Joseph Brant was a Mohawk war chief, and the Six Nations, or most of the Six Nations, supported the crown during the American Revolutionary War. Unfortunately, with the British losing the American Revolutionary War, the Six Nations were dispossessed of their lands in upstate New York, though the Seneca and Tuscarora still have extensive holdings. Most of the Six Nations ended up living in Upper Canada, Ontario, along the Grand River. The Governor General at the time, a man by the name of Sir Frederick Haldimand, purchased land along the Grand River, 6 miles on either side, from the mouth of the Grand River on Lake Erie to its source at Dundalk, and ceded that in perpetuity to the Six Nations. Now, how did Anthony Westbrook end up fighting in a Mohawk war party with Joseph Brant? Well, Joseph Brant commanded a mixed war party of First Nations warriors and white guys. Somewhere in the range of 90 to 300 non-First Nations people supported the Crown and fought in Joseph Brant's Mohawk War Party. Anthony Westbrook was one of them. In fact, Anthony Westbrook helped Joseph Brant burn the town of Minnesink, New York, where he was from. He led Brant around the town, pointing out all of those who were loyal to the Crown, and saved their homes and property. The rest, well, they got torched. After the American Revolutionary War ends, Anthony Westbrook attempts to go back to Minnesink, figuring bygones will be bygones. Well, didn't work out that way. And in 1788, he comes back to the province of Quebec. So the province of Upper Canada doesn't come into existence till 1792. That's when John Graves Simcoe becomes the first lieutenant governor. Up until then, where we're standing is the province of Quebec. And had the American Revolutionary War never happened, I'd be speaking to you in French. Anyway, 1788, Anthony Westbrook comes back to Quebec, what will become Upper Canada. But he has a problem. Because he didn't serve in an official British regiment or an official British provincial regiment, and those are regiments that are raised in the province, he's not entitled to compensation and he's not entitled to a land grant. See, all of the regiments, as I said, Butler's Rangers, they were settled in the Niagara region, which at the time was known as the Nassau District. King's Royal Regiment of New York, King's Rangers, Queen's Rangers, Peter's Corps, Jessup's Corps, a few German regiments, along with disbanded British soldiers, were settled between Belleville and the city of Cornwall. They are the foundation of the province. But Anthony Westbrook, because he didn't serve in any of those regiments, he doesn't get a land grant. Now, this area is Six Nations territory. Whites were not permitted to settle here, but Anthony Westbrook and a few others did. And those few others were men who had served with Joseph Brant. And Brant gives Anthony Westbrook a 100-acre grant of land on a 999-year land lease in this area. So this graveyard would have started out as a piece of Anthony Westbrook's farm. And it's now the town of Canesville, which is just immediately east of Brantford, which is named after Joseph Brant, because Joseph Brant established a ford here. This was also the principal town of the Six Nations until they moved to Ohsweken. And that is how one guy came here, an American loyalist, serving with the Six Nations War Party, and Joseph Brant wouldn't leave him in the lurch and granted him a land lease in Six Nations territory, because Joseph Brant took care of his men. There are a number of Brant's volunteers who are not First Nations who were settled in this area. There's James Park's family, there's Barnhard. They all served with Joseph Brant. They were not entitled to land grants. Over the years, they intermarried with Six Nations people. Anthony Westbrook's sons farmed land on the east side of Fairchilds Creek, which is just over this way. Stories. Stories about people, places, and things. And had the American Revolutionary War never happened, the province of Upper Canada, the province of New Brunswick, the country of Sierra Leone, and ultimately Canada would never have come into existence. And Quebec would have stretched through what is known to Ontario to the top of the Mississippi watershed, and I'd be talking to you on my YouTube channel, Parlez-vous français? And my French is impetit, so I'm not even going to try beyond that. But that's history. And like photography, which captures stories, history tells stories. Stories like Anthony Westbrook, stories like Joseph Brant and how the Six Nations ended up at the Grand River, 6 miles on either side from the mouth to the source. The founding of York, modern-day Toronto, and me as a 6-year-old standing in the middle of Fort York looking around going, wow, this is really cool. I want to do this. History, however, is messy. It's not polite, it's not clean. And you have to accept it, warts and all. You can't rewrite it because it happened and it's there for us to look at and to learn from. It is always a lesson. And that's why I'm a history geek as well as a photography geek, and why I look at both and combine the two. Hence, my channel at times can seem a little schizophrenic. But the first photograph was taken in 1834. It looks really primitive by our standards, but it's really cool. And the guys who developed it lead directly to me standing here talking to you about Anthony Westbrook and the American Revolutionary War. In your own areas, there are all kinds of interesting stories. Some of them date back to the 18th century, some of them date back to the 19th century. You should go and check them out. Go and look at old graveyards because they tell stories. Go and read historic plaques. Just remember, in your wanderings and explorings, looking for stories, just keep walking with a camera. Till next time, cheers. Take care, Anthony.